The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in golden hues as Marcus Thompson adjusted his camera lens for the 100th time. As a wildlife photographer for National Geographic, he had traveled to countless remote locations, but the Chiricahua Apache Reservation held a special mystery that drew him like a magnet. His assignment was simple: document the daily life and traditions of the Apache people for a cultural preservation project. Marcus had been staying at the reservation's guest lodge for 3 weeks, slowly building trust with the community elders. The Apache people were naturally protective of their privacy, especially after generations of exploitation by outsiders. But Marcus's respectful approach and genuine interest in their culture had gradually opened doors that remained closed to most visitors. On this particular morning, he decided to venture deeper into the mountains where few tourists ever went. The tribal council had given him permission to photograph the ancient petroglyphs hidden in the canyon walls, but only with the understanding that certain sacred sites would remain off-limits to his camera. As he hiked along the narrow trail, the desert silence was broken only by the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. The path wound through towering saguaro cacti and weathered rock formations that seemed to guard secrets from another time. Marcus felt the weight of history in every step, knowing that Apache warriors had once used these same paths to protect their homeland. After 2 hours of climbing, he reached a secluded spring that the locals called Whispering Waters. The natural pool was surrounded by ancient cottonwood trees, their leaves creating a canopy of shade that provided relief from the intense desert sun. This was supposed to be a safe area for photography, far from any sacred ceremonial grounds. Marcus set up his equipment quietly, hoping to capture the interplay of light and shadow on the water's surface. The spring was considered a neutral zone, a place where nature photography was permitted as long as no people were included in the shots. He worked methodically, adjusting his settings to capture the pristine beauty of this hidden oasis. The sound of splashing water made him freeze. Through his telephoto lens, he could see ripples disturbing the previously calm surface of the spring. Someone was there. Someone who clearly believed they were alone in this remote location. Marcus lowered his camera immediately, knowing that respect for privacy was paramount in Apache culture. But as he started to pack up his equipment, a figure emerged from behind the rocks near the water's edge. It was a young Apache woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with long black hair that caught the sunlight like silk. She wore traditional beaded jewelry that marked her as someone of importance within the tribe, and her presence carried an air of quiet confidence that spoke of deep cultural knowledge. What happened next would change both their lives forever. As the woman stepped toward the spring, apparently preparing for a traditional purification ritual, she noticed the glint of Marcus's camera lens in the distance. Their eyes met across the sacred space, and time seemed to stand still in the desert heat. The woman's name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her native tongue. She was the granddaughter of the current tribal chief and had been chosen from childhood to be a keeper of ancient traditions. Her role required her to perform certain rituals in solitude, away from the eyes of both outsiders and most of her own people. The spring at Whispering Waters was one of her sacred places, where she came to commune with the spirits of her ancestors. Seeing a stranger with a camera in this most private of moments sent shockwaves through her entire being. Not because she felt violated, but because Apache tradition held specific beliefs about what happened when sacred rituals were witnessed by outsiders. According to the old ways, such an encounter created a spiritual bond that could not be easily broken. Marcus immediately raised his hands to show he meant no harm, his camera hanging uselessly around his neck. He had photographed indigenous cultures around the world and understood the gravity of accidentally intruding on sacred practices. But something in Ayana's gaze told him this was different from any cultural misunderstanding he had encountered before. "I'm sorry," he called out across the distance, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I didn't know anyone was here. I'll leave immediately." But Ayana didn't move. Instead, she studied him with dark eyes that seemed to look straight through to his soul. She had heard about the photographer from the elders, knew that he had been granted limited access to document their culture. What she hadn't expected was to encounter him here, in this place where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest. According to the beliefs passed down through generations of her family, when a sacred ritual was witnessed by an outsider, it created what the Apache called a spirit thread between the two people. This invisible connection meant their fates were now intertwined, for better or worse. Breaking such a bond without proper ceremony could bring misfortune not just to them, but to their entire families and communities. You cannot simply leave, Ayana finally spoke, her voice carrying across the water with surprising strength. What has been seen cannot be unseen. What has been shared cannot be taken back. Marcus felt a chill despite the desert heat. He had studied Apache customs extensively before coming to the reservation, but his academic knowledge hadn't prepared him for the intensity of this real-life encounter. The way Ayana spoke suggested this was more than just a breach of etiquette. It was a spiritual crisis that required immediate attention. As if sensing his confusion, Ayana began to walk toward him, her movements graceful despite the rocky terrain. With each step, Marcus became more aware of the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about accidentally photographing someone. It was about intersecting with a worldview that operated by entirely different rules than his own. My grandmother will need to be told, Ayana continued as she approached. The tribal council will need to be informed. What happens next cannot be decided by us alone. The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. He had come to the reservation as an observer, someone who could document Apache culture from a respectful distance. Now he found himself pulled into the very heart of traditions he barely understood, connected to a young woman whose life was governed by customs that stretched back centuries. As they stood facing each other beside the ancient spring, both realized that their lives had just taken an unexpected turn. The photographing assignment that had brought Marcus to Apache land was now the least of his concerns. Whatever happened next would be determined by forces much larger than either of them, guided by traditions that demanded respect for the spiritual bonds that connect all living things. The desert wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwood leaves above them like whispered warnings from the ancestors. Both Marcus and Ayana knew that by sunset, their private encounter would become a matter for the entire tribe to consider. The question that hung in the air between them was simple yet profound. What price would they both pay for a moment that was never meant to happen? The tribal council meeting was called for that very evening, just as the sun began to set behind the Chiricahua Mountains. Word of the encounter at Whispering Waters had spread through the reservation like wildfire, carried by the network of relationships that kept Apache communities connected across vast distances. By the time Marcus and Ayana arrived at the ceremonial building, representatives from 3 neighboring tribes had already gathered to witness what would unfold. Ayana's grandmother, Elena Crowfeather, sat in the place of honor at the center of the circle. At 87 years old, she was one of the most respected medicine women in the entire Southwest, known for her ability to interpret the old ways and apply them to modern situations. Her weathered hands rested on a ceremonial staff that had been passed down through 7 generations of tribal leaders. Marcus sat on a woven mat across from Ayana, acutely aware that he was the only non-Apache person in the room. The elders had insisted he be present for the discussion, explaining that decisions made about his spiritual fate could not be made without his participation. The gravity of the situation became clearer with each passing moment as more people filed into the circular room, their faces serious and contemplative. The spirits have brought us a challenge, Elena began, her voice strong despite her advanced age. When the sacred waters are witnessed by an outsider during purification, the old teachings tell us that a bond has been created that cannot be ignored. This bond affects not just the 2 people involved, but the spiritual balance of our entire community. She turned her gaze to Marcus, studying him with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of countless generations. Young photographer, you have been respectful of our ways since arriving here, but respect alone cannot undo what has been done. The spirits do not recognize good intentions. They respond only to actions and consequences. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he realized the full implications of what Elena was saying. This wasn't just about cultural sensitivity or making amends for a mistake. According to Apache belief, his presence at the spring had created a spiritual disturbance that could affect the well-being of the entire tribe if not properly addressed. What does the tradition require? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena exchanged glances with several other elders before responding. There are only 2 paths forward that honor the old ways. The first is banishment. You must leave Apache lands forever and never return. This breaks the connection but also brings shame to our community for failing to properly guide a guest. The room fell silent as the weight of the first option settled over everyone present. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized that choosing banishment would effectively end his career as a cultural photographer. More importantly, it would mean abandoning the meaningful relationships he had begun to build with the Apache people. The second path, Elena continued, is one that has not been walked in over 50 years. When the spirits create a bond between an outsider and one of our own, that bond can be honored through marriage. This makes the outsider part of our community and transforms what could be a spiritual crisis into a source of strength. The word marriage hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire. Marcus felt his world shift on its axis as he tried to process what he was hearing. Ayanna, meanwhile, sat with her eyes downcast, her face a mask of calm that couldn't quite hide the turmoil beneath. "Grandmother," Ayanna spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Surely there must be other options. This man is a stranger to our ways and I barely know him beyond our brief encounter." Elena's expression softened as she looked at her granddaughter. "Child, I know this is not the future you envisioned for yourself, but the spirits rarely ask for our permission before weaving our destinies together. The question is not what we want, but what will bring balance and harmony to our people." An elder from one of the neighboring tribes leaned forward, his voice adding gravity to the discussion. "The photographer has shown respect for our customs. His work has brought positive attention to Apache culture, without exploitation. Perhaps the spirits are telling us that some outsiders can be trusted to become insiders." Another voice joined the conversation, this time from a middle-aged woman who served as the tribe's cultural preservation coordinator. "But marriage is sacred in our tradition. It cannot be entered into lightly, even for spiritual reasons. Both parties must be willing participants, not just victims of circumstance." Marcus felt all eyes turn to him as the discussion continued. The elders were essentially asking him to choose between exile and marriage to a woman he had met only hours before. Either choice would fundamentally alter the course of his life, but only one would allow him to remain connected to the Apache community that had become so important to him. "If I may speak," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as he found his resolve. "I came here to learn about Apache culture, but I never expected to become part of it. However, if my presence has created a spiritual imbalance, then I accept responsibility for finding a solution." He looked directly at Ayanna for the first time since the meeting began. "I don't pretend to understand all the traditions involved, but I respect them. If marriage is what the spirits require to restore harmony, then I'm willing to consider it, but only if Ayanna agrees freely, without pressure from family or tradition." Ayanna raised her eyes to meet his, and for a moment, the crowded room seemed to disappear around them. In her dark gaze, Marcus saw not just a young woman faced with an impossible choice, but someone who carried the weight of her entire culture on her shoulders. As a keeper of traditions, her decisions affected not just her own life but the spiritual well-being of generations to come. "The choice is mine to make," Ayanna said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was deciding. "But I will not make it tonight. The spirits may have created this situation quickly, but wisdom requires time to develop. I ask for 3 days to seek guidance through prayer and meditation." Elena nodded approvingly at her granddaughter's request. "Wisdom speaks through you, child. 3 days is reasonable. During this time, the photographer will remain as our guest, but he must not leave the reservation. The spiritual bond that has been created makes his departure dangerous until this matter is resolved." As the council meeting concluded and people began to file out of the ceremonial building, Marcus found himself both relieved and terrified. He had 3 days to prepare for a decision that would change everything about his life. More challenging still, he had 3 days to get to know Ayanna well enough to understand whether they could build a life together based on something more substantial than spiritual obligation. As they walked out into the desert night, with stars beginning to emerge in the vast Arizona sky, both Marcus and Ayanna knew they were standing at a crossroads that would define not just their individual futures, but the way their two very different worlds might come together. The next 3 days would determine whether the spirits had brought them together as a gift or as a test of their faith in traditions that demanded everything in service of community harmony. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on them both as they separated to spend their first night contemplating a future neither had imagined when the sun rose that morning. The first day of the 3-day waiting period began before dawn, with Ayanna making her way to a small meditation cave high in the mountains where Apache women had sought spiritual guidance for countless generations. The cave walls were decorated with pictographs painted by her ancestors, depicting stories of love, sacrifice, and the eternal struggle between individual desire and community responsibility. As she sat in the sacred space, burning sage and cedar to clear her mind, Ayanna reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. She had always known that her role as a keeper of traditions would require sacrifices, but she had never imagined that one of those sacrifices might be the right to choose her own husband. Yet, as she prayed for guidance, she couldn't shake the memory of the respect and genuine concern she had seen in Marcus's eyes during the council meeting. Meanwhile, Marcus spent his day learning more about Apache marriage customs from Joseph Strongheart, a tribal elder who had volunteered to serve as his cultural guide during the waiting period. Joseph explained that traditional Apache marriages were not just unions between two people, but sacred contracts that bound entire families and clans together in networks of mutual support and obligation. In the old days, Joseph explained as they walked through the reservation's cultural center, marriages were often arranged by families based on spiritual compatibility rather than romantic love. The belief was that deep affection would grow naturally between partners who were spiritually matched by the wisdom of their elders. Marcus listened carefully, trying to understand how such a system could work in practice. But what about personal choice? Surely people had some say in who they married. Joseph smiled, his weathered face crinkling with understanding. Choice existed, but it was exercised differently than in your culture. Young people could express preferences, and no one was forced into a marriage against their will. But the final decision always considered what was best for the entire community, not just the happiness of two individuals. As they continued their discussion, Marcus began to realize that the situation he found himself in was not as unusual in Apache culture as he had initially thought. The idea of marriage as a solution to spiritual or community problems was deeply embedded in traditions that valued collective harmony over individual desires. On the second day, Ayana emerged from her meditation cave with a clearer understanding of what the spirits were asking of her. She had received visions during her prayers that suggested the encounter at Whispering Waters was not an accident, but part of a larger pattern that connected past, present, and future in ways she was only beginning to understand. She sought out her grandmother, Elena, finding the old woman tending to her garden of medicinal herbs behind the tribal health clinic. The two women sat together among the aromatic plants, sharing a silence that spoke of deep understanding between generations. "What did the spirits tell you?" Elena asked finally, her hands continuing to work among the healing plants. "They showed me a bridge," Ayana replied thoughtfully. "A bridge between our world and the outside world, built not from compromise but from genuine respect. They showed me that some connections are meant to preserve our culture by sharing it with those who can truly appreciate its value." Elena nodded slowly, having sensed that her granddaughter's 3 days of contemplation would lead to this conclusion. "And what do your own feelings tell you about this man?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I see someone who came here seeking to understand, rather than to take. Someone who stopped taking photographs the moment he realized he might be intruding. That kind of respect cannot be taught. It comes from the heart." On the evening of the second day, Marcus and Ayana met for the first time since the council meeting. They walked together along a path that led to an overlook where the entire reservation spread out below them, dotted with lights from homes where Apache families were gathering for dinner and evening prayers. "I've been thinking about what kind of life we might build together," Ayana said as they stood watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant oranges and purples. "Not just as husband and wife, but as partners in preserving and sharing our culture." Marcus turned to look at her, seeing in her profile the strength of generations of Apache women who had faced impossible choices with grace and wisdom. "I've been thinking about that too. I realized that everything I came here to document, the traditions, the connection to the land, the importance of community, those things would become part of who I am if we go through with this marriage. It would mean giving up your old life," Ayana pointed out. "Your career as a traveling photographer would have to change. You would belong here, to this place and these people, in a way that few outsiders ever experience." "I know," Marcus replied, "but I've also realized that what I thought I wanted from life was really just a shadow of what I could have here. Documenting cultures from the outside is nothing compared to actually becoming part of one." As the third day dawned, both Marcus and Ayana knew what their decision would be. They had discovered that the spiritual bond the Apache believed had been created between them was reinforced by a growing emotional connection built on mutual respect, shared values, and a common vision for the future. The final council meeting took place as the sun reached its peak in the desert sky. The same elders who had gathered 3 days earlier returned to hear the decision that would affect not just 2 lives, but the spiritual balance of the entire community. Elena Crowfeather called the meeting to order with the same ceremonial staff she had held during the first gathering. 3 days have passed, she announced. The time has come for the spirits to speak through those they have chosen. Ayana stood first, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the assembled elders. I have prayed and meditated according to our traditions. I have sought guidance from the ancestors and listened to the wisdom they have shared. I choose to honor the bond that was created at Whispering Waters through marriage, not from obligation, but from a belief that this union will strengthen our community and help preserve our culture for future generations. Marcus rose to stand beside her, his voice equally steady as he spoke. I accept the responsibility and honor of joining the Apache people through marriage. I understand that this choice means becoming not just Ayana's husband, but a member of this community with all the obligations and privileges that entails. I make this choice freely, with respect for traditions I am still learning to understand. The room erupted in quiet conversation as elders discussed what they had heard. After several minutes of consultation, Elena stood to deliver the council's response. The spirits have spoken through both of you, she declared. Your words show that what began as a spiritual crisis has become an opportunity for growth and connection. The council approves this union and welcomes Marcus Thompson into the Apache people as a full member of our community. As cheers and congratulations filled the ceremonial building, Marcus and Ayana looked at each other with a mixture of relief, joy, and anticipation for the future they would build together. What had started as an accidental encounter at a sacred spring had become the beginning of a love story that bridged two worlds while honoring the traditions that made such bridges possible. The wedding ceremony took place 1 month later, conducted according to Apache customs that celebrated not just the union of two people, but the joining of different worlds in mutual respect and understanding. As Marcus and Ayana exchanged vows beside the same spring where their fates first intertwined, they knew they were creating something new while honoring something ancient. Their marriage became a symbol of how traditional cultures could engage with the modern world without losing their essential character. Marcus's photography work evolved to focus exclusively on Apache life, but now from the perspective of an insider rather than an outsider. His images, guided by Ayana's deep cultural knowledge, became powerful tools for education and cultural preservation. Years later, when people asked them about the unusual circumstances of their meeting, Marcus and Ayana would smile and explain that the spirits had simply used an apparent accident to bring together two people who were meant to serve their community as partners. Their love story became part of Apache oral tradition, told around fires and passed down through generations as an example of how respect, patience, and faith in ancient wisdom can transform unexpected challenges into lasting blessings. The spring at Whispering Waters remains a sacred place on the reservation, but now it holds an additional meaning as the site where two different worlds discovered they could become one without either losing its essential identity. For Marcus and Ayana, it serves as a daily reminder that the most meaningful connections in life often begin with moments that seem like mistakes but reveal themselves to be destiny in disguise.